Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, the only place where sleepless nights aren't cured by melatonin, but by monks with ink-stained fingers pitching salvation like it's the next unicorn startup. Tonight's pitch is simple. What if medieval monasteries weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, but the Silicon Valleys of their time? Because, let's be honest, if you squint past the Latin and the incense, what you see is a hive of productivity, strict schedules, product market prayers, and something suspiciously close to version control, carved onto calfskin. So settle in, light a candle, or just pretend you're in a stone chamber with no central heating, and let's begin our monastic accelerator tour, one manuscript at a time. Chapter 1. The Sacred Pitch Deck. Benedict of Wessex is not your average monk. He's not content illuminating the same psalms every day while rats chew through the bottom of the scriptorium shelves. No, Benedict is what you might call a visionary. In the year 1132, that basically means he talks too much during silent hours and scribbles ideas in the margins of sacred texts. The others call it heresy. He calls it product design. His latest parchment scroll, neatly rolled and sealed with wax, isn't a prayer or an apology. It's a proposal. He calls it Salvatech, Scalable Salvation Solutions for the Faithful. The pitch? We take the word, streamline the message, optimize the rituals, and bring it all directly to the peasantry. No intermediaries, no gatekeeping. Just grace, fast-tracked. In any other age, Benedict might have found himself on a TEDx stage. Here, he's begging for candle wax and divine seed funding from the Abbey's Council of Elders. Let's pause here. Because while this sounds absurd, monks pitching salvation with bullet points, it's really not that far from what was happening. Medieval monasteries weren't lazy, quiet hideaways. They were innovation factories. Scriptoria, that's the room where monks copied manuscripts, were hotbeds of information tech, just pre-electric and powered entirely by shame and guilt. Need user onboarding? That's novitiate training. Quality control? Every manuscript is checked by a senior monk with trembling hands and a full-bladdered disdain for sloppy Latin. Scalability? Hire more monks. If one dies from eye strain or ink poisoning, you promote the next one. Call it monk flow automation. And who funded all this? Rich people. Lords, barons, even monarchs dumped land and gold into monasteries. Not for enlightenment, mind you, but for spiritual insurance. Give an acre, save your soul. Early access salvation packages. Back to Benedict. His pitch scroll features rough sketches of portable altars, a concept stolen, let's be honest, from pagan nomads. He suggests modular chapel units that could be wheeled to battlefields or trade fairs. One elder gasps. Another weeps. But one, old brother Anselm, whose arthritis keeps him from copying much of anything anymore, leans in. Does this include relic distribution, he asks. Now that is the right question. You see, relics were the NFT of the medieval age. The toe bone of a saint? Limited edition? Splinter from the true cross? Verifiably unique. The whole system thrived on scarcity and mystique. You don't just own the relic, you believe it. And that's what makes it valuable. Sound familiar? So when Benedict suggests an API, Apostolic Prayer Interface, he says, where peasants can submit prayer requests on wax tablets and receive blessed tokens via courier monks within a fortnight, he's not mocked. He's feared. Because he's talking about scale, disruption, efficiency. And medieval institutions hate efficiency. Let's talk about the real-world mechanics here. Monasteries were the information silos of their day. They housed libraries, stored legal contracts, tracked births, deaths, debts. If your village burned down, it was the local abbey that had your documents, your land records, your baptismal proof. They weren't just holy men. They were gatekeepers of knowledge, bureaucrats in robes. But like any institution, monasteries were riddled with bottlenecks. Only a few monks could write. Ink was expensive. Vellum required slaughtering a calf. Mistakes meant weeks of rewrites. And there were always monks like Benedict ones who thought, what if we didn't spend 6 weeks copying a sermon by candlelight? What if we summarized it in one verse with illustrations? The very idea of simplifying doctrine bordered on blasphemy, because opacity was power. The more complicated the Latin, the more you needed a monk to explain it. And that dependency? That's the business model. Let's not kid ourselves. This was a spiritual cartel. Benedict's vision scroll, however, includes something truly dangerous, a section labelled Open Source Homilies. Sermons for the people, in local dialects, not Latin. Annotated with crude illustrations. Even jokes. He calls it Faith for All. The elders call it heresy adjacent, and yet they don't throw him out. Because part of them knows that Benedict is the future. A painful, candle wax-scented future, but a future nonetheless. Before the segment ends, a messenger monk bursts in with news. A rival monastery across the river is already offering miracle tokens to local pilgrims. Supply-side grace economics. The council blinks. Benedict smiles. He's already drawing up his next scroll, sent as a service. Benedict didn't sleep that night. Not because he was anxious about the council's reaction. He was already used to the tightrope walk between genius and heresy, but because he was transcribing his next pitch by oil lamp, pressing the last of the abbey's ink into parchment like it owed him interest. He titled it modestly, Veneration and Venture Capital, How to Monetize Miracles Without Upsetting God. Because if chapter 1 of this startup saga was about the idea, this chapter was about traction. The miracle market was already saturated. Competing monasteries were offering indulgences with loyalty perks. Some even had roadside relic stands for pilgrims, complete with souvenir breadcrumbs and water blessed, just enough to cause superstition, but not enough to provoke papal audits. The whole thing smelled of sanctity and scam in equal measure. And Benedict? He wanted in. The problem wasn't a lack of belief, it was logistics. Miracles weren't scalable. They happened sporadically, often in inconvenient locations, and always under divine discretion. And let's be real, nothing kills a startup faster than unreliable supply chains. What Benedict proposed instead was predictable wonder, a standardized inventory of approved miracles. The idea was to take the heavenly and make it manageable. He broke it down into tiers. Tier 1, basic blessings. Think fertility bumps, mild rain, improved crop yields. Tier 2, intermediate intercessions. Cures for plagues with an asterisk, victory in minor skirmishes, livestock resurrection. Tier 3, premium providences. Stigmata sightings, angelic visions, spontaneous weeping statues. All miracles were to be pre-approved by a subcommittee of monks trained in optics, deception detection, and very selective storytelling. The pitch was almost too modern for its time. Predictability as a product. The religious elite had always trafficked in mystery, but Benedict understood something they didn't want to admit. The people were getting bored. Latin was fine, but it didn't trend. What trended was spectacle. And not everyone had time to walk 200 miles to maybe see a toe bone. And here's the dark reality beneath the reverence. Relics were forged, miracles faked, visions rehearsed. Not because the monks were malicious, but because the system demanded results. You can't feed 30 scribes on faith alone. So they got creative. A strategically placed lamp behind a statue, instant halo, a hidden lever, and lo, the Virgin weeps. It was performance art, baptized in incense. And Benedict wasn't the first to notice. He was just the first to package it as a product. The council, for their part, remained skeptical. Brother Thomas, a strict traditionalist with a spine curved like a shepherd's crook, argued that faith was not a currency to be spent. But even he had to admit that the abbey's coffers were dangerously low. Donations were down. Pilgrimage traffic had shifted to the Abbey of St. Ferris, 2 valleys over, thanks to a spontaneous fish-shaped shadow that appeared on their refectory wall. Benedict suspected fraud. He also respected it. To test his theory, he launched a pilot program. The monks rebranded an old saint's tomb as a miracle vault. Inside, they installed coloured glass to simulate holy light and sprinkled imported frankincense for atmospheric effect. Visitors were told that praying near the vault increased their likelihood of divine favour by 37%. Why 37%? Because vague math sounds scientific, and science makes peasants feel reassured. It worked. Within weeks, offerings tripled. One merchant claimed his goat gave birth to twins. Another said his wart vanished. Benedict logged each success as a case study, titling the scrolls with impressive names like Proof of Concept and Version 2.1, Faith Metrics. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. The nearby Cistercians filed a formal complaint, accusing Benedict of miracle laundering. The bishop sent a courier demanding clarity. Benedict replied with a 17-page document outlining the abbey's pilgrim engagement funnel, complete with marginalia sketches of angelic user flowcharts. The bishop, confused and mildly impressed, blessed the effort as innovative if opaque. But beneath the incense and optimism lay something darker. The monks were burning out. The miracle vault needed constant upkeep. The glass cracked. The incense ran low. And worst of all, the illusion wore thin. One pilgrim peered behind the altar and saw Brother Elric adjusting a pulley. Faith was fragile when handled like a commodity. And here comes the criticism wrapped in sarcasm. For all their piety, the medieval church was astonishingly comfortable with branding. They would have made exceptional social media managers. #blessed. Swipe up for salvation, just don't question the back end. Benedict, to his credit, knew this couldn't scale forever. He began drafting plans for a distributed monastery network, an affiliate system of smaller chapels reporting back data on miracle efficacy. His notes used words like synergy and fidelity optimization. He didn't invent the spreadsheet, but he came dangerously close with a grid system that tracked sin to salvation ratios. And in the middle of this divine bureaucracy, no one noticed that real miracles, quiet forgiveness, humble service, patient listening, had all but vanished. In chasing engagement, they'd lost something sacred. But then again, maybe that was the miracle, that belief could survive even the monks. Chapter 2, Seed Funding and Sacred Relics. You might imagine a monastery as a place of silence, solemn reflection, and incense-heavy stillness. But step into a 12th century cloister during Matins, and what you really encounter is the medieval version of a hackathon. Rows of weary monks scribbling like underpaid engineers on a deadline, muttering Latin under their breath like debugging spells. It's not peace, it's productivity. This, friends, is the cloister incubator. Imagine it, stone archways draped in mist, moss climbing up every surface, and beneath it all, a cold but industrious pulse of divine hustle. Monasteries were the original co-working spaces, not the airy, beanbag and exposed brick variety, but the real thing. Bare walls, iron discipline, and a shared vision of eternal relevance. And they didn't even need caffeine. Just guilt and deadlines. You had your departments. The scriptorium was DevOps, the brewery was product testing, and the chapel, that was PR. Every prayer, every chant, every page of illuminated text was part of the brand. And make no mistake, medieval monasticism was deeply concerned with brand identity. A Benedictine wasn't a Cistercian, and neither would be caught dead chanting like a Carthusian. Subtle distinctions in robes and rituals formed entire corporate identities, each with their own KPIs, knowledge of prayer initiatives, naturally. Enter Brother Matthew. Not particularly holy, not particularly likeable, but excellent with ink ratios. He'd figured out how to stretch 1 goat bladder's worth of ink across 11 folios by diluting it with vinegar and graphite. This made him the de facto resource optimizer of the abbey. Some saw him as frugal, others called it a sin against legibility. But in the fast-paced world of scripture duplication, legibility was a luxury. Through Matthew, we meet the very soul of monastic innovation, necessity disguised as holiness. This innovation wasn't always celebrated. The abbot preferred tradition, which is code for, "Don't mess with my comfort zone." So Brother Matthew pitched his dilution process as a vow of austerity. Less ink per word, more humility per page. And because monasteries loved austerity almost as much as they loved land donations, it worked. But austerity had its limits. These cloistered hubs weren't just about working harder. They were about working endlessly. Monks awoke before dawn to chant, eat, chant again, copy texts, chant more, clean the latrines, chant once more, and then collapse under woolen blankets so scratchy they doubled as penance. It was a schedule designed by someone who clearly hated joy. Yet within it lay a system optimized for output, distraction-free and deeply iterative. No monk worked alone. Each scribe had a reviewer, and each reviewer an overseer. A single spelling error could set back an entire week of copying. Brother Stephen once misspelled Gloria as Goria, which sounded uncomfortably pagan. His punishment was a week in silent contemplation with only stale bread and the book of Leviticus for company. If that doesn't scream code review with consequences, what does? And let's not overlook the training pipeline. Novices were onboarded through what can only be described as an endurance gauntlet, memorizing psalms, fasting until delirium, and learning how to cut vellum without slicing a finger. Failure was common. Blood on the scroll? Start over. Pride in your calligraphy? Repent immediately. The whole process made modern onboarding seem like a massage retreat. Still, the productivity was staggering. Monasteries preserved more classical texts than any modern library in their heyday. That's right. While the world burned, monks were quietly running a content management system powered entirely by daylight and divine fear. And like any good startup, they faced constant threats. Viking raids, local wars, internal schisms. One particularly ambitious group even tried to poach talent, convincing 3 scribes to defect and form their own breakaway priory. It ended with a scuffle over inkpots and a highly unchristian brawl in the nave. But this environment of constraint bred creativity. With limited resources and even less external input, monks invented everything from timekeeping devices to improved crop rotation systems. They were AAB testing before anyone knew what that meant. Want better crop yield? Try night ploughing. Want fewer stomach aches? Brew beer instead of drinking from the well. These weren't accidents. They were iterative improvements backed by generations of observational data and trial, by divine error. And yet, let's not get too romantic. For all the innovation, the cloister was also a bubble insula, resistant to dissent, and sometimes absurdly dogmatic. Brother Matthew once suggested using Arabic numerals for easier calculation. The idea nearly got him exorcised. Progress was welcome, sure, but only if it didn't make the elders feel obsolete. This is the light criticism wrapped in habit and hood. These monasteries could have propelled Europe into an earlier enlightenment, but their obsession with hierarchy and ritual slowed the curve. Information hoarded is knowledge denied. And denial, in this case, was dressed as reverence. Still, within those walls, something remarkable happened. The cloister became a crucible, not just of prayer, but of process. Everything was trackable, improvable, scalable. If only the monks had known how close they were to inventing agile methodology. Then again, maybe they did. The Rule of St. Benedict is basically a project management handbook written in archaic prose. It stresses order, discipline, reflection, and continuous improvement. So the next time you fire up your productivity app, or stand in a circle explaining why your task isn't done, remember this: monks were doing it first. Only their sprints lasted centuries, and their burnouts came with eternal consequences. And as for Brother Matthew, he eventually left the cloister to join a new order dedicated to scientific inquiry and better beer. History doesn't remember him as a saint, but maybe it should have. Silence, they said, was holy. But inside a monastery, silence was more than holiness. It was policy. It was the official productivity hack. No chatter, no wasted words, no off-topic conversations about whether Brother Francis had once seen a woman's ankle during his travels. Only focus. It sounds idyllic, until you realize silence enforced by threat of punishment is less about peace and more about control. If you've ever worked in an office where the manager insists on quiet time while glaring over the cubicles, you've had a taste of medieval silence culture. For a monk, every day was planned down to the minute. Wake at 2 a.m. for matins. Chant until dawn. Copy manuscripts until your fingers went numb, and then farm. Pray, eat in silence, pray again, and collapse before repeating it all tomorrow. It was efficiency carved into stone. The rule of St. Benedict might as well have been called the Startup Founder's Guide to Crushing Souls. Maximum productivity, minimum individuality. The cloister incubator had no tolerance for distraction. Brothers who dozed off during prayer were slapped with penances that ranged from fasting to manual labour in the latrine trenches. Sleep deprivation wasn't an accident. It was built into the schedule. Keep a man just tired enough, and he won't have the energy to question authority. It was the perfect model of human resource management. Control morale by never letting it fully recover. Now, here's the darker truth. Many monks didn't choose this life. Younger sons of noble families were shoved into monasteries because their families couldn't afford another heir. Poor peasants were lured in by promises of bread and literacy. What looked like devotion was often coercion, thinly veiled by Latin scripture. If today's startups guilt their interns into unpaid work with promises of exposure and experience, monasteries did the same thing centuries earlier. Only instead of stock options, you got the occasional stale loaf of bread and the vague hope of eternal life. Brother Marcus is a good example. Pressed into the monastery at 14, he discovered quickly that his life would not be one of theological brilliance, but of back-breaking, repetitive labour. He spent his days sharpening quills and cleaning ink pots. The elders told him this was humility. He knew it was exploitation. But what could he do? Leaving was heresy, and heresy came with stakes and flames. So Marcus endured, like countless others, grinding through divine busywork, while the abbots kept ledgers fat with land grants. The truth is, monasteries were HR nightmares wrapped in piety. No grievance procedures, no appeals, and the only feedback loop was confession, where your line manager also happened to be your confessor. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to describe it. Imagine telling your boss that you skipped morning prayers because you doubted God's existence, and then watching him write down your punishment as if filling out a performance improvement plan. Burnout was inevitable. Monks collapsed from exhaustion, blindness, and malnutrition. Some even fled, braving accusations of apostasy rather than endure another year of back-to-back chanting. And here's where the criticism bites. Monasteries claimed to save souls, but they often broke bodies. They sold themselves as sanctuaries of peace, yet functioned like sweatshops powered by guilt and obligation. Of course, the irony is that within this oppressive system, brilliance still emerged. Monks devised new farming tools, kept time with water clocks, and preserved ancient knowledge through sheer, grinding persistence. They were like overworked engineers writing code in a toxic startup, producing genius in spite of, not because of, the system that trapped them. And while the silence enforced discipline, it also bred madness. Extended periods without speech led some monks into hallucinations. Visions of demons crawling across the scriptorium floor weren't always metaphorical. The combination of candle smoke, eye strain, and relentless isolation made for fragile minds. In startup terms, the cloister was a pressure cooker of innovation and burnout, a place where breakthroughs were inevitable, but so were breakdowns. And yet, people kept joining. Why? Because monasteries offered something that medieval society rarely did: stability. Food, shelter, and a guaranteed schedule, even if it was grueling. For peasants who lived in constant fear of famine or war, the cloister was predictably harsh, but at least it was predictable. Like a bad job with steady pay, it was better than starving. Let's not forget, too, the brand power. Monks were admired for their discipline, their supposed holiness. To the outside world, they looked like paragons of virtue, humming with sacred focus. The reality was far messier, filled with politics, rivalries, exhaustion, and the occasional fistfight behind the cloister garden wall. The silence covered a multitude of sins. So the cloister incubator, for all its flaws, succeeded at one thing. It created an ecosystem where ideas were tested, refined, and stored. Not because it cared about the monks, but because it cared about survival. The monastery as an institution knew how to extract maximum output from minimal freedom. And that, perhaps, is why it endured for centuries. Brother Marcus, for his part, eventually became a skilled illuminator, producing manuscripts so exquisite they were sold to nobles for sums that funded the abbey's expansion. He never saw a coin of it. His payment was the occasional sip of imported wine and the promise of heaven. In any other world, he might have been an artist, an inventor, even a leader. Here, he was just another cog in the cloister machine. And that is the cruel brilliance of the cloister incubator. It turned men into engines, silence into fuel, and devotion into deliverables. Call it holy, call it efficient, but let's also call it what it was: the original burnout factory, dressed in robes and chanting prayers to hide the sound of cracking mines. Chapter 3: Code Monks and Scriptorium Engineers. Every product begins as an idea, and every monastery began with a problem: too many prayers, not enough time. It sounds absurd, but medieval monks genuinely faced a scalability issue. The church demanded ever-expanding volumes of praise, psalmody, chants, and memorized scripture. The average monk's day was stuffed tighter than a goose before Christmas, and yet every year brought more saints to venerate, more feast days to observe, and more liturgical padding to memorize. They needed a solution. And thus, the monastic MVP was born: minimum viable psalms. In startup culture, MVP means building the smallest thing that still delivers value. In a monastery, it meant trimming the divine fat without risking your soul. It started innocently enough. A few lazy monks in northern France decided to chant only every third line of Psalm 119, which, for the record, is a marathon of 106 verses. They said it was symbolic. They said it heightened devotion through a mission. Really, they were tired, but word got around. Soon, a neighbouring priory halved their morning litany, claiming increased focus and fewer cases of chronic chanting fatigue. Suddenly, everyone was testing new formats. Psalm 51 in haiku. The Lord's Prayer as a choral call and response. One particularly bold brother reduced the entire Book of Hours to what he called the essence of awe. 7 syllables, chanted once per hour. He was nearly excommunicated, but only because the elders didn't understand what a syllable was. Enter Brother Alwyn, an administrator with the soul of a timekeeper and the patience of a scribe. He saw the fragmentation happening across abbeys and decided to codify it. He created a chart mapping time spent in prayer against measurable outputs: copies produced, crops harvested, candles rolled. It was the medieval equivalent of a dashboard. His findings were damning. The most pious monks, the ones chanting the full psalms with all the trimmings, were also the least productive. They illuminated fewer manuscripts, copied fewer texts, and routinely fell asleep during Vespers. Spiritual output, it seemed, came at the cost of everything else. Brother Alwyn took his chart to the abbot. The old man squinted, frowned, and asked what a horizontal axis was. But the message was clear. God, it turned out, wasn't good for business, at least not in high doses. So they reached a compromise. Alwyn was allowed to test a new schedule in one wing of the abbey. Fewer psalms, more productivity, stricter focus. The monks there began churning out twice the number of manuscripts. One even invented a faster drying method for ink. It was a revelation, and a quiet revolution. Before long, monasteries across the continent were copying Alwyn's system. They cut prayer hours, introduced rest cycles, and even drafted the first known manuals on efficient chanting. Monks learned to hum instead of sing, to skip doxologies unless nobility was present, and to recycle melodies from feast to feast. One Cistercian abbey reportedly sang the same chant for every occasion: births, deaths, weddings, and plagues. They called it the universal melody. It was horrible, but it saved time. Critics, of course, emerged. Elder monks accused Alwyn of heresy by abbreviation. One called him the butcher of Benedictine rhythm. But they couldn't argue with results. Wealthier abbeys adopted his reforms and grew richer. Poorer ones resisted and became increasingly irrelevant. Even bishops began requesting condensed liturgies for long journeys and short attention spans. The church, that ancient and supposedly immovable institution, was quietly pivoting. Now here's the dark twist. In trimming the rituals, something sacred was lost. Monks reported feeling spiritually hollow. One confessed to hearing silence during prayer. Not divine silence, but the echo of habit with no meaning. As chants became shorter, the time between them felt louder. The rush for efficiency had created a vacuum, and in it, doubt began to fester. It turns out, when you strip religion of repetition, you sometimes strip it of resonance. And here's the sarcasm dipped in candle wax. What a surprise that productivity culture, even dressed in robes, forgot to ask what the work was for. The monks had optimized their rituals, but at what cost? Faith, once lived slowly and with ritual weight, now flickered like a candle running out of wick. But hey, the margins were up. Still, the MVP movement didn't slow. Like any trend with measurable gains, it metastasized. Monasteries began outsourcing their chant labor to nearby lay brothers, training villagers to hum at half volume during feast days. Scribes were given standardized templates with modular openings. Even sermons were reduced to index cards. One abbot famously delivered his entire Easter address in 14 words. No one remembered the words, but everyone remembered the applause. And yet, despite all this absurdity, there was genius in it. The monks were learning to adapt, to flex, to respond to a changing world. Pilgrimage traffic was declining. Donations were slowing. And though no one said it aloud, heresies were gaining ground. In this landscape, speed and clarity were survival. It wasn't about whether the minimum viable psalm was sacred. It was whether it worked. Brother Alwyn died quietly, with no feast day to his name and no miracles attributed to his reforms. But in the decades after his death, his schedules lived on. Even the most rigid abbeys adopted fragments of his system, whispering his name like a cautionary blessing. They never canonized him. Efficiency rarely earns sainthood. Still, the next time you hear a truncated chant or see a scripture summarized in bullet points, tip your hat to Alwyn. He proved that even in the most sacred systems, there's always room for iteration. Whether or not the soul survives it, that's another question entirely. Once the MVP model took hold in the monasteries, it wasn't long before the logic of optimization began to infect every other corner of spiritual life. The monks had tasted efficiency, and like any institution chasing performance metrics, they couldn't stop. If fewer psalms saved time, why not fewer sacraments? Why not cut corners everywhere, as long as the divine illusion held firm? And so began the era of modular theology. You see, medieval Christianity was never exactly simple. The rituals were layered, symbolic, and bound up in centuries of tradition. There were prayers for sunrise, prayers for rain, blessings for wheat, and ceremonies for every conceivable kind of suffering. But in the wake of Brother Alwyn's reforms, a new mindset crept in. Segment, standardize, deploy. Abbeys began drafting modular homilies, short moral lessons that could be slotted into any liturgical calendar. They came on reusable scrolls, often colour-coded for tone, red for wrath, blue for mercy, gold for political weddings. These homilies weren't inspired, they were compiled. Entire libraries emerged containing plug-and-play morality, written by monks who hadn't seen a real sin in years but were excellent at allegory. Critics called them sermon snippets. Supporters called them scalable grace. And the truth, as always, was more complicated. At the heart of this shift was an uncomfortable question. If monks could produce more manuscripts, more wine, more sheep wool, and more hymns by cutting down on time spent praying or meditating, did that make the monastery more holy, or less? No one could agree. Some argued that good deeds were the true measure of devotion. Others insisted that time spent in direct worship was sacred in itself. But by the late 13th century, most monasteries had quietly chosen a side. They chose production. Brother Gervais, a monk stationed in a wealthy Flemish abbey, developed what he called the liturgical wheel, a kind of flowchart that allowed users to identify the correct prayer or penance based on a simple questionnaire. Are you remorseful? Ye N. Did someone die? Ye N. Was it your fault? Circle 1. The wheel would then point to a corresponding psalm, sermon, or silent nod. It was fast. It was flexible. It was wildly popular. Pilgrims loved it. They didn't have time for all the rituals. They wanted forgiveness with a one-day turnaround. Priors loved it. They could track spiritual throughput like they tracked wine barrels. And the bishops? They looked the other way. As long as the tithes kept coming and the relics remained authenticated, innovation was tolerated, sometimes even blessed. But speed comes at a price, and the first casualty was reflection. Once confession became a checkbox, it lost its teeth. Once sermons were condensed into index cards, they stopped stirring the soul. One monk wrote that his morning devotions felt like measuring fog with a stick. Another admitted to repeating the same homily 3 weeks in a row. No one noticed. The words still filled the air, but meaning had quietly slipped out the back. There were darker consequences too. Modular theology made it easier to justify almost anything. Crusade? Just plug in a passage about righteous war. Famine? A quick story about Job. Heresy? Rotate in a tale of Sodom and a sprinkle of apocalyptic dread. It was theology as a service, tailored to fit the moment, not the moral. And here's where the criticism sharpens. The monks didn't mean to cheapen faith. They were just trying to survive. Europe was changing. Trade routes were shifting. Nobles were investing in universities instead of monasteries. The intellectual centre of gravity was drifting towards cities, where scholars argued in Greek and carried notebooks instead of prayer beads. Monasteries felt left behind. So they did what institutions always do when they're threatened. They got lean, they got fast, and they lost sight of what they were for. Brother Alwyn, though long dead, was blamed retroactively. His name became shorthand for hollow devotion, for faith without flavour. But the truth was never that simple. He had seen a genuine need. He had tried to adapt a bloated system to changing realities. But like any good system left unexamined, it metastasized into bureaucracy. By 1300, some abbeys had stopped singing altogether during minor feast days. They played pre-recorded chants on rotating scrolls using water-powered rollers, a crude but effective form of automation. One abbey in Normandy even tested wax cylinder voice recordings read aloud by novices in shifts. It failed when Brother Hughes fell asleep mid-recitation and repeated the same phrase for 6 hours. But the intent was clear. If man could no longer carry the weight of devotion, then mechanism would step in. Bells rang on timers, candles lit by pulley, scripture copied by scribes who no longer believed. It was all so efficient, so clean, so heartless. And still, it worked. Sort of. Monasteries survived. They fed the poor. They stored books. They healed the sick. But they became places of process rather than passion. The sacred had become scheduled. And the soul? Well, it was penciled in between Lords and lunch. Looking back, it's easy to mock them. What fools, cutting corners on eternity. But before we get too smug, let's ask ourselves, how many of our rituals, our meetings, our messages, our memorials are just as hollow? How many times have we chosen convenience over meaning? Because modular theology wasn't a mistake, it was a mirror. And what it showed was that even the most sacred systems will trade depth for speed when survival is on the line. Not because they're evil, but because they're tired. Chapter 4, The Cloister Incubator. By the dawn of the 14th century, monasteries had evolved from humble houses of prayer into well-oiled spiritual enterprises. But every empire, sacred or otherwise, eventually seeks new markets. And the next great frontier wasn't script or song. It was souls. Not just the salvation of them. The acquisition, valuation, and if necessary, the aggressive marketing of them. Welcome to the era of angels, demons, and angel investors. Let's be clear, medieval Europe was a fear-based economy. Death was everywhere. War, plague, famine, childbirth, dentistry, all were statistically unsafe. And when you live in a world where heaven is up, hell is down, and purgatory is a DMV staffed by flaming bureaucrats, you start to crave certainty. Monasteries saw that fear, and like any savvy business, they monetized it. Relics became the speculative assets of the age. A fragment of St. Apollonia's jawbone could sell for more than a year's harvest. Abbeys competed to acquire the most bizarre holy objects: the foreskin of Christ, milk from the Virgin Mary, feathers from the Archangel Gabriel. One monastery claimed to possess the tears of St. Augustine, conveniently preserved in a crystal vial labelled in shaky Latin. No one questioned the authenticity, because in a world without authentication standards, faith filled in the gaps. Enter Brother Raymond, a relic hunter turned relic broker. Fluent in Greek, Latin, and creative exaggeration, Raymond travelled across Europe swapping forged St. Knuckles and holy sandal fragments like a medieval hedge fund manager. He operated under the belief that anything could be sacred if blessed quickly enough and wrapped in gold thread. His biggest client? The Abbey of St. Eligius, which aimed to build the continent's first relic vault. The plan was simple: collect relics, raise funds through indulgence campaigns, and offer tiered access to divine proximity. Want to pray near a Tier 3 bone? That's free. Tier 2? A small donation. Tier 1, reserved for actual martyrs and A-list saints, required land, livestock, or heirlooms. It was heaven as imagined by venture capital. Naturally, the rich jumped at the chance. If indulgences offered spiritual tax breaks, relic access was the platinum card. Nobles donated estates. Merchants offered dowries. The poor, they offered what they had, belief. And that belief kept the entire apparatus standing. But belief, when stretched too far, begins to tear. The problem was supply. There are only so many saints to go around, and martyrdom rates weren't keeping pace with demand. So monasteries got creative. They began issuing derivative relics, objects that had merely touched the original relics. A tooth that kissed St. Peter's staff. A robe that grazed a splinter of the true cross. These items came with certificates, usually written by the very monks selling them. Critics called it relic inflation. Monks called it grace extension. And here's where the sarcasm stings. Even demons were co-opted. Some abbeys began selling protective tokens against specific devils, each with unique branding. Got insomnia? Blame incubus. Got back pain? That's Belphegor. Buy the right medallion, hang it over your bed, and sleep demon-free. Never mind that these medallions were churned out by terrified novices under torchlight, each inscribed with symbols copied from a book no one fully understood. Fear was a currency, and business was booming. And the angels? They weren't left out. Monasteries began commissioning illuminated manuscripts depicting heavenly beings, not just as messengers, but as divine endorsements. Owning a painting of Saint Michael slaying Lucifer became the medieval equivalent of holding stock in spiritual stability. One monk even claimed that placing the image near livestock increased fertility. It didn't. But he published 3 scrolls about it, and the rumour stuck. Behind all this, of course, was the growing tension between faith and finance. The church insisted these practices were acts of devotion. But the ledgers told another story. Abbeys hired scribes to track relic revenue, indulgence flows, and prayer traffic by the feast day. When numbers dipped, promotions followed. Some monasteries launched what can only be described as divine marketing campaigns, miracle festivals, weeping statue unveilings, and fast-track forgiveness weekends. It was around this time that the term angel investor took on an unfortunate double meaning. Wealthy patrons who funded new chapels or relic acquisitions were called guardians of grace. Their names were etched in stone, their portraits commissioned, their souls allegedly secured. In return, they demanded exclusive rights, first access to blessings, reserved pews, and in some cases private masses. One bishop even proposed a loyalty program, 10 prayers, 1 indulgence free. And here's the darker truth. This wasn't heresy. It was orthodoxy weaponized. The rules were followed, the prayers were said, the blessings were issued. But somewhere along the way, the holiness became hollow. The relics kept coming. The donations flowed. But the silence after Vespers grew heavier, like even the stone walls were beginning to question the game. Brother Raymond eventually vanished. Some say he retired to Sicily. Others whisper he was buried with a counterfeit jawbone and a note that read, "It worked, didn't it?" The Abbey of St. Eligius still stands. Its relic vault has been rebranded as a museum. The donations have slowed. But the bones? They remain on velvet pillows, encased in gold, proof that belief, once properly packaged, can outlive even the believers. So the next time someone offers you certainty in exchange for a small fee, remember this chapter. Faith is free, but the accessories, they'll cost you. The problem with belief as a business model is that eventually it demands bigger miracles. The early days of subtle piety and whispered revelations simply couldn't keep up with the competition. When one monastery claimed its relic cured blindness, the one across the valley responded with a corpse that allegedly sang hymns. Miracles escalated like tech startups chasing quarterly growth. And just like with any bloated system, the cracks began to show. It started with small inconsistencies. The relic of St. Genesius, kept in 3 separate abbeys, began to raise eyebrows when pilgrims compared notes. One had his right femur, another the left, and a third swore they had his entire skull. This might have gone unnoticed if Brother Pascal, a particularly fussy scribe, hadn't started cross-referencing relic registries. What he found was enough to make parchment curl, saints with 2 hearts, 5 skulls, and enough limbs to form a divine golem. The higher-ups responded, not with reform, but with performance. Monasteries began staging miracles. Not in the sense of lying outright, no, that would be crass. These were dramatized reenactments, sacred simulations. A statue that wept, helped along by a cleverly hidden water bladder. A blind man who saw, played by a novice with excellent timing. They called it visual theology, and insisted it was merely symbolic. Brother Ambrose was the quiet genius behind this innovation. a failed actor turned monk after a scandal involving a bishop's niece and a poorly executed miracle play. He applied his stagecraft to the spiritual economy. He choreographed the lighting of candles to sync with chants, trained monks to feign rapture at key moments, and even introduced subtle cues for gasps among the audience. The faithful, unaccustomed to spectacle, wept openly. And it worked. Donations spiked. Pilgrims returned. The abbey expanded. Ambrose was promoted to liturgical director, a title no one had held before or would hold again. His masterpiece, the Ascension Tableau, a Sunday ritual where a statue of Christ slowly rose into the rafters on hidden pulleys while incense poured from ceiling vents. It was, by all accounts, breathtaking. It was also completely artificial. But here's the part that stings. It didn't matter. People believed because they needed to. Life was brutal, short, and terrifying. If a painted statue floating in candle smoke gave a peasant mother the strength to bury her third child, then who were the monks to stop it? Faith had become theatre, and the church's job was now part pageant, part therapy. Whether or not the miracle was real became less important than whether it felt real. A sort of medieval placebo effect wrapped in incense and Latin. Of course, not everyone was on board. The traditionalists pushed back. Elder monks muttered about vanity and sacrilege. One scriptorium revolt led to a week-long strike, during which no manuscripts were copied. The abbey nearly missed a delivery to a noble patron, who in turn threatened to rescind a donation. The rebellion was crushed with bread rations and prayer penalties. Brother Ambrose was told to tone it down. He did, slightly. But the damage was done. Other monasteries took notice. Soon, everyone had their own miracle shows. A bleeding crucifix here, a floating relic there. Some even hired travelling performers to reenact biblical events. The lines blurred. Was it liturgy or illusion? Was grace being manufactured like a product? And yet again, it all came back to survival. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centres, they were landlords, employers, economic hubs. If pilgrims stopped coming, villages collapsed. If nobles lost interest, roads went unpaved, hospitals unfunded. The divine had to perform or the system would crumble. And so miracles became metrics. Brother Pascal's concerns were buried under scrolls of revenue. He tried to compile a report on the proliferation of questionable wonders. It was ignored. He rewrote it with footnotes. Still ignored. Finally, he illuminated it with golden letters and a miniature of Ambrose winking at a weeping virgin. That got attention. He was exiled the next week. The report? Lost. Here's the criticism, wrapped in incense. The church claimed to shepherd souls, but too often it entertained them instead. It promised truth, but dealt in approximation. And when the lights dimmed and the pilgrims went home, the monks sat in silence, wondering when exactly the sacred had become a sales pitch. Even Brother Ambrose began to fade. His miracles grew repetitive. The crowds, once enthralled, now yawned. One child whispered, "I saw the rope, and it spread like wildfire." Ambrose tried to innovate. He introduced fire. It backfired, literally. The chapel ceiling blackened. The abbot's beard caught a spark. The show was cancelled. Ambrose was reassigned to candle duty. The relics remained. The statues still wept when the mechanism worked. But the magic had dulled. Monasteries, once grand arenas of belief, began to look tired. Not broken, just overproduced. Like a touring band playing the same old hymn, hoping the crowd would still sing along. And yet faith endured. Not in the miracles, but in the spaces between them. In whispered prayers behind dusty pews. In the hands of monks who still, somehow, believed. Not in showmanship, not in relics, but in something quieter, older. So perhaps the real miracle is this, that despite the rope, despite the pulleys, despite the burning beards and fake tears, people still hoped. And hope, inconveniently, isn't scalable. Chapter 5. Monastic MVPs. When startups burn out, they pivot. When they collapse, they seek acquisition. But when a medieval monastery began to falter, it didn't call in consultants. It called in saints. Or fire. Or both. Welcome to the confessional exit strategy. You see, medieval monasteries, for all their incense-drenched holiness, weren't built to last forever. Like any human institution, they faced entropy. Donations dried up, pilgrims lost interest, nobles found new causes. Sometimes even God seemed to have moved on, and when the miracle machine stopped humming, the brothers found themselves staring into the abyss of irrelevance. But no one retires gracefully from eternity. The first strategy was merger. When one abbey began to decline, it would send subtle feelers to nearby rivals, letters written in veiled piety. Perhaps our communities might share liturgical burdens, or may the Lord guide us into joint stewardship. Translation, we're broke, your soup is better, let's combine choirs. These mergers were awkward affairs. Monks with different chants, different schedules, even different saints. One side would insist on singing Psalm 42 at sunrise. The other preferred silence until the third hour. Fistfights broke out over candle placements. But when mergers worked, they allowed abbeys to pool relics, combine land holdings, and present a unified face to patrons. The church approved. After all, fewer failing abbeys meant fewer embarrassing scandals. And behind the scenes, relic inventories were shuffled like playing cards. One finger of St. Catherine quietly became an elbow. Who would know? The second strategy was rebranding. Take the Abbey of St. Fortunatus. By the mid-1300s it had lost most of its monks to plague or fatigue. Its relics were unverified, its garden overgrown. But one enterprising abbot renamed it the House of Everlasting Vigil, claiming the remaining 3 monks prayed in shifts, 24 hours a day. It wasn't true. 2 were mostly deaf, and the 3rd napped between chants. But the story spread. Nobles loved the idea of perpetual prayer. Donations trickled back. Other monasteries tried similar tricks. Some adopted exotic saints from far-off lands, inventing backstories and miraculous genealogies. One claimed to house the sandals of St. Mercurius the Fleet. Another insisted its wine cellar doubled as a healing shrine. As always, authenticity was optional, but appearance crucial. And then there was the nuclear option, the holy fire. Records are sparse, and church historians are vague, but more than a few monasteries mysteriously burned just before insolvency. No monks harmed, no relics lost, but all debts vanished in smoke. Insurance didn't exist, but penance was cheaper than accounting. The narrative afterward was always the same, lightning or divine purification. Brother Theobald, a monk with a suspicious collection of oily rags and a fondness for controlled chaos, was rumoured to have orchestrated at least 2 such exits. When questioned, he simply quoted Revelation and smiled. He later became a bishop. Now here's the darker irony. These exits were framed as acts of humility. Monks declared they were relinquishing earthly concerns, or transcending institutional constraints. In reality, they were managing collapse through narrative. They were failing upward, cloaked in robes. And the faithful? They rarely noticed. As long as the bells rang, the sermons echoed, and the candles flickered, the abbey remained holy. No one asked how many monks still lived there, or whether the relic had been authenticated in the last century. The illusion held. But for the monks themselves, the unravelling was harder. Brother Anselm, once a master illuminator, spent his final years copying the same line of scripture over and over. Vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas. Vanity of vanities, all is vanities. He knew the monastery was failing. He watched the pews empty, the gold flake off the altar. But he kept writing. Because what else was there? Others drifted away. Some left quietly in the night, exchanging habits for peasant cloaks. A few joined new orders, chasing fresher rituals and more vibrant patrons. And the rest, they endured. Not out of zeal, but habit. Because routine is powerful, and hope, even when hollowed out, clings to structure. And here comes the criticism, soft but steady. The church, for all its grandeur, had no plan for decline. It celebrated birth, glory and martyrdom, but never fading. Monasteries weren't allowed to die. They had to transform, rebrand, combust. Anything but admit that even faith-based systems wear down. There was no hospice for the sacred, so the confessional exit became the unspoken blueprint. Merge if you can, rebrand if you must, burn if you're clever. But never admit you're irrelevant, because relevance in the medieval world was tied to salvation, and losing one might mean losing the other. The final irony? Some of these failed monasteries are now tourist sites, their stones rearranged, their silence commodified. Tour guides explain their histories with reverence and drama. Here, the monks chanted through famine. Here, a miracle once glowed in the rain. No mention of the ledger, the exit strategy, the oily rags, just stories. And in a way, maybe that is the most enduring miracle of all, that even when the faith faltered, the story stayed alive, smoke, ashes and all. When a monastery vanished, whether by merger, miracle or mysterious fire, it didn't just leave behind ashes and echoing cloisters, it left behind confusion for the peasants, the pilgrims, the widows clutching prayer tokens and the sick waiting on relics. It was like waking up to find God's local office had quietly shut down, and there was no customer service. No one explained to the surrounding villagers why the bells no longer rang, or why the courtyard was now overgrown with nettles. One day you were assured that praying before St. Eligius's toe could heal your boils, and the next the reliquary was missing, and a few shell-shocked monks were bartering for bread in the town square. Divine continuity, it turned out, had a few operational gaps. Some monasteries tried to ease the transition. They sent scribes to draft elaborate closing statements, filled with phrases like called to higher silence and transference of sacred stewardship. These were read aloud by trembling friars who barely understood them. For most villagers, the real translation was clear. The monks were broke, the saints were gone, and the shrine was now a chicken coop. Others made no announcement at all, just empty pews, abandoned scrolls. The smell of extinguished incense lingering a little too long. In the absence of clarity, myths took over. One tale claimed that a monastery disappeared because its monks had finally achieved perfect holiness and ascended as a group. Another insisted that they'd been cursed by a demon hiding in the scriptorium inkwell. Still another, perhaps the most honest, simply blamed the bishop's nephew and a suspiciously timed tax levy. But for the faithful, none of this was satire. It was heartbreak. For decades they'd been taught that monasteries were eternal anchors of divine presence, and now those anchors were slipping, floating away on tides of debt, fatigue, and quiet institutional collapse. Some tried to carry on the rituals themselves. Villagers gathered to chant psalms with no monks to lead them. Farmers maintained herb gardens where monks once brewed tonics. A few self-appointed visionaries declared themselves lay abbots and attempted to restart the miracles manually. Results were mixed. And yet, something strange emerged from this collapse. Freed from the rigid schedules and theatrical spectacles of monastic life, some communities rediscovered a quieter, humbler form of devotion. Without relics to venerate or indulgences to purchase, they turned to one another. Prayer circles replaced processions. Simple alms replaced ornate tithes. It wasn't efficient, it wasn't lucrative, but it was, perhaps, more honest. This terrified the church. Because decentralization, even in matters of grace, is a threat to power. Bishops dispatched new monks to re-establish order. Travelling friars arrived with pre-approved sermons and freshly blessed icons. The goal wasn't revival. It was restoration of control. The holy brand had to stay intact. After all, if people realized they didn't need velvet-wrapped bones or Latin rituals to feel close to God, What would happen to the infrastructure? But the damage was done. The cracks were visible. Records from the period show a marked increase in local heresies, movements that questioned papal authority, cults of saints with no ecclesiastical approval. The flagellant movement, self-punishing believers who wandered town to town, exploded in popularity. Were they fanatics? Certainly. But they were also evidence of spiritual desperation. People were searching for meaning in the vacuum left by the departing monks. Even the architecture changed. New churches were built smaller, simpler, closer to towns. The towering isolation of monastic compounds began to look absurd, a grand facade for a system that had quietly folded under its own theological weight. And here's the lingering criticism. The monasteries fell not because God failed them, but because they mistook infrastructure for intimacy. They thought holiness could be stacked like bricks, stored in cabinets, locked in vaults. But once the walls cracked, once the chants faded, the illusion scattered like dust. All that was left was the naked question, what now? Some monks asked it out loud. Brother Callistus, once a relic custodian, wandered for years with nothing but a loaf of bread and a wooden cross. He preached simplicity. He refused money. When asked where his monastery had gone, he simply said, "Back into the earth." Others clung harder to the system. They joined wealthier abbeys, enforced stricter routines, doubled down on miracle quotas. But they were relics themselves now, moving, chanting, obedient, but hollowed by the collapse they had survived. And the people? They kept praying. Not always in churches, not always in Latin. But the need for hope didn't vanish when the doors closed. It adapted, it evolved. And in a way, that was the real confession. That even when the sacred structures failed, the human hunger for something beyond the self endured. Unscripted, unfunded, unmonastic. So, if the confessional exit strategy taught the church anything, it was this. You can't scale the divine like parchment. You can't outsource belief. And no amount of relics, rituals, or relic-backed incentives can replace the quiet truth that, in the end, every monastery is just a building, and every believer just a soul looking for light. Chapter 6, The Rise and Fall of Friarnet. Before TikTok priests and blue-check bishops, before live-stream baptisms and algorithm-blessed sermons, there were monkfluencers. They didn't call themselves that, of course. They were humble, mostly. But make no mistake, they knew exactly what they were doing. Because, in the absence of modern media, medieval monasteries built the first content ecosystems, complete with brand ambassadors, viral scrolls, and spiritual product placement. Let's rewind to the late 1300s. With many monasteries struggling to remain relevant and solvent, the old relic game had lost its edge. Pilgrims were less impressed with finger bones and miracle water. The average peasant had seen enough weeping statues to last a lifetime. What they craved now wasn't magic, it was personality. They wanted stories, charisma, engagement. Enter Brother Godric of Lüneburg. Godric was tall, loud, and unusually photogenic for a time without cameras. He had perfect posture, an unforgettable voice, and a flair for dramatic pauses. He wrote hymns. He illustrated his own manuscripts. He sprinkled jokes into sermons. When he entered a village, people followed, not because of doctrine, but because he was interesting. The abbey noticed. Soon, Godric was granted his own scriptorium team. His sayings were copied onto scrolls and distributed across monastic networks. His sermons were quoted by other monks, sometimes verbatim, sometimes poorly paraphrased. One even became a tavern chant, slightly drunk, slightly heretical, but undeniably catchy. He had become the medieval equivalent of a breakout star. Naturally, other monasteries wanted in. They began grooming their own monkfluencers. Brother Elmo of Montserrat, known for his dramatic flagellations and soulful weeping. Sister Batilda of Mainz, a reclusive nun whose prophecies arrived in dreamy fragments. Brother Philemon of York, who insisted all of his teachings be sung in falsetto. Some were sincere, some were pure performance, all were popular. This birthed the scroll economy. You see, scrolls were the only medium of mass communication available, besides gossip, which was faster but harder to monetize. Monasteries began producing themed scrolls featuring their stars. There were wisdom compilations, prayer packs, even illustrated miracle reprints. Wealthier patrons commissioned exclusive copies, bound in dyed leather with personalized blessings. These weren't just devotional tools, they were collectibles, limited edition holiness. And, as with any economy, demand drove production. Scribes worked overtime copying phrases that had tested well with audiences. God sees your toil became a bestseller. Sin is the sweat of the soul was translated into 5 dialects. Some monasteries even hired poets to punch up older scrolls. The goal wasn't truth, it was traction. Now here's where it turns dark. As monasteries chased popularity, theology got blurry. Passages were trimmed, verses softened. Anything too complex was omitted. After all, nuance doesn't go viral. A complex discussion of grace and penance? Skipped. But a pithy line about heaven being a garden for the grateful? That got copied so many times, it ended up engraved on a bishop's chalice. Brother Godric himself began to change. He stopped writing about contemplation and started focusing on inspiration. His sermons became lighter, his metaphors broader. His scrolls grew flashier, with gilded initials and miniature angels crowding the margins. Critics accused him of vanity. His supporters said he was meeting the people where they were. It worked. For a while. Godric drew crowds that rivaled market fairs. His name was invoked in disputes. His face, painted on a wall in Ghent, became an accidental pilgrimage site. He didn't claim sainthood, but some followers did. And the abbey? They built a new dormitory with the proceeds. But then came the backlash. Other monks, especially from strict orders, began accusing the scroll economy of cheapening devotion. They called it a theology of applause, a religion of slogans. Anonymous tracts began circulating handwritten critiques of Godric and his imitators. One bitter monk wrote, "Better a silent sinner than a singing fraud." And yet even these criticisms were copied and shared. Some began selling for coin. Outrage, after all, has always been profitable. It became difficult to separate truth from trend. Were people repenting or just reciting lines? Were monks pursuing sanctity or just audience share? Brother Elmo died mid-sermon, reportedly with one eye on the crowd. Sister Bertilda vanished. Some say she fled the convent to escape the noise. Brother Godric's end was quieter. He returned to solitude in his final years, scribbling private confessions that never circulated. One scroll, found decades later, reads, "I built a mirror and mistook it for a window." Here comes the criticism wrapped in vellum. Monasteries, once guardians of sacred memory, had begun chasing moments. They traded permanence for popularity. They mistook distribution for devotion. And in doing so, they sowed the very seeds of disillusionment that reformers would later harvest with fire and hammer. Because if truth is bent too far toward trend, it doesn't snap back. It splinters. Still, the scroll economy left behind something undeniably powerful. Not the theology, not the slogans, but the hunger it revealed. People didn't want polish. They wanted presence. They wanted someone to explain the storm and still walk beside them in the rain. The monkfluencers, for all their flaws, gave voice to that need. And if they sometimes shouted into mirrors, at least they were still shouting. And in a world without microphones, that mattered. By the time the scroll economy hit its peak, the lines between spiritual enlightenment and medieval influencer culture had fully blurred. Monkfluencers weren't just spreading sermons anymore. They were merchandising them. Cloisters began offering signed scrolls, devotional tokens bearing the faces of popular brothers, and in one regrettable case, a limited-run prayer wheel inscribed with motivational mantras that suspiciously resembled wine-stained riddles. Competition between monasteries intensified. What had once been cooperative scriptural preservation now devolved into spiritual branding wars. Scribes were poached from rival abbeys. Scroll layouts were copyrighted informally. A monk in Avignon was nearly excommunicated for colonial illumination after mimicking a particularly ornate border design. And the content itself? It started to rot. What had begun as inspired reflection slowly devolved into algorithmic spirituality. Certain phrases performed well, so they were repeated. "You are the candle," "God is the flame," appeared in over 800 manuscripts. "Faith is the boat, hope is the oar," was slapped onto everything from psalters to tavern walls. Even the sacred began to sound like self-help. Monkfluences, hungry for novelty, pushed further into abstraction. "Let the silence inside you ring with God's echo," won awards at a monastic retreat, though no one knew what it meant. This wasn't harmless piety. It was the soft collapse of meaning. With scroll production booming, authenticity took a hit. Ghostwriting became common. Lesser monks were assigned to draft under the name of more famous brothers. One industrious scribe in Prague reportedly wrote an entire year's worth of Brother Ignatius's Reflections on Dust series, without ever meeting him. It sold well. No one cared. Worse still, the black market emerged. Unlicensed scrolls flooded the roads between abbeys. Pilgrims bought knockoff sermons at roadside stands, some hilariously off-brand. One claimed, "He who eats garlic shall inherit heaven." Another featured a crudely drawn dove vomiting fire. These were not church-sanctioned, but they were cheap, portable, and mildly entertaining, which, in the eyes of most peasants, made them just as useful. Monastic authorities tried to intervene. Councils were called, bans were issued, scroll audits were conducted, inquisitors were dispatched to sniff out theological plagiarism. But enforcement was patchy. The public, meanwhile, kept consuming. Because even in the medieval world, when something becomes content, it doesn't go back to being scripture. It becomes a brand. Some monasteries leaned into it. Abbeys began assigning entire teams to handle inspirational output. Others dabbled in genre, comedic psalms, romantic parables, mystery liturgical hybrids. One daring monk experimented with early confession fiction, a blend of dramatic sin and divine redemption, aimed at noblewomen with spiritual appetites and time to burn. It sold faster than ink could dry. And yet, within all this novelty, there was a growing sense of decay. The spiritual elite began to fracture. Benedictines accused Augustinians of peddling empty phrases. The Cistercians rolled their eyes at Franciscan scroll poetry. Dominican friars took to preaching against monkfluences in public squares. One even shouted, "You seek followers, not salvation," and was promptly stoned by a crowd who thought it was part of the act. Inside the monasteries, tension built. Novices were no longer trained to understand theology, they were trained to perform it. Vows of silence were lifted for monks deemed vocally gifted. Illuminators were replaced by production line scribes. One abbey installed an hourglass in the script room and paid copyists by the scroll. It was fast, it was flashy, it was hollow, and it became obvious something had to break. Brother Gideon, a minor monk from a fading abbey, finally snapped. During a scroll release event, yes, that was a thing, he stood on the lectern and tore the parchment in half. "God is not a slogan," he shouted, before being escorted out by candle-bearing assistants. His moment went unnoticed by most, but the few who remembered it later marked it as the first spark of dissent. Others followed. Underground movements began to circulate, samizdat-style counterscrolls. These texts mocked monkfluences, reprinted older scripture without edits, and encouraged readers to seek God through silence, work, and humility. They weren't popular, they weren't monetized, but they were real. And here's the quiet criticism. In trying to reach the people, the monasteries forgot to meet them. They shouted from platforms, but stopped listening. They crafted messages so general they stopped being messages at all. And in doing so, they paved the path not to reformation, but to rejection. Because when belief becomes performance, it invites skepticism. And when skepticism meets silence, it builds momentum. Scrolls that once sold for silver were now used to light fires. Monkfluencers retired. Some disappeared. Others were absorbed into the system they once gamified. The crowd moved on, hungry for truth that didn't glitter. Brother Godric died with a full library and an empty chapel. His name faded. His phrases lingered for a while, but even they lost weight. And yet, in the dust of his decline, something fragile returned. Not applause, not fame, but stillness. And from that stillness, the whisper of something sacred trying to breathe again. Chapter 7. Angels, Demons, and Angel Investors. At a certain point, even monasteries realized that inspiration wasn't enough. Not in a Europe roiling with war, plague, taxation, and increasingly literate peasants who were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about where, exactly, all that tithing money was going. When the scrolls stopped selling and the relics lost their shimmer, the church fell back on its most enduring resource: guilt. Guilt had always been useful, but now it would be engineered, refined, quantified. Welcome to the confessional algorithm. Of course, they didn't call it that. They called it penance reform, sacramental regularization, or the new pastoral discipline. But make no mistake, it was an algorithm in every sense. It mapped input, sins, weighed variables, severity, frequency, social class, ran them through a formula, confession, absolution, assigned penance, and produced an output, cleansed soul, temporarily. It was spiritual computation built on tiers and tally marks. The old ways had been more flexible. Confession was a private affair. The penitent knelt. The priest listened. A few prayers, maybe a pilgrimage, perhaps a donation. Done. But that system lacked consistency. Too much discretion. Too little data. And so, by the 15th century, certain monasteries began developing what they called penitential grids. These were literal charts, vellum scrolls covered in inked boxes and ranked offences. Lust was bad, envy worse. Murder? Surprisingly negotiable if you were a noble and the victim was a peasant. Brother Thaddeus of Rouen was an early pioneer. Obsessed with order and racked with guilt from a youthful sin involving a misplaced relic and a barrel of wine, he compiled a 200-entry catalogue of sins with corresponding penances. Gossiping. 3 Hail Marys. Coveting another monk's ink. A day of fasting, causing a schism. 7 days barefoot on cold stones while reciting Psalm 51 with a mouthful of thorns. His chart spread quickly. Why? Because it removed uncertainty. For the monks it meant fewer decisions. For the confessors it meant standardization. And for the penitents it meant predictability. Sin became a service. Repentance, a subscription. Some monasteries went even further. They began tracking sin trends. Which offences surged during Lent? When did envy peak in wine-growing regions? Were women more prone to pride, or was it a scribal bias? Brother Oswin at a German priory began compiling weekly sin reports. These were reviewed at chapter meetings and sometimes read aloud. It sounds absurd, but they were serious. If salvation was the goal, shouldn't it be measurable? Naturally, abuses crept in. Confession booths became mini-courts. Some monks handed out harsher penances to peasants to encourage deeper obedience. Wealthy patrons received indulgence shortcuts. One abbey introduced penance tokens, small carved bits of wood the size of a coin. Each represented a completed act of penance. These were supposed to be symbolic. Instead, they became tradable. Peasants sold theirs. Monks hoarded them. One scribe recorded a nobleman buying 30 tokens in advance, hoping to prepay for a festival weekend of sin. Critics emerged, of course. A Dominican friar named Calixtus wrote a scathing tract titled On the Commodification of Contrition, accusing monks of turning confession into a ledger. He was ignored. Or rather, his pamphlet was quietly absorbed, edited, and re-released by a rival abbey under the title Confession Made Clear. The irony writes itself. And here's the darker side. Confession, once intimate, became transactional. The soul was still invoked, but rarely felt. Monks began to judge not just sins, but delivery. A penitent who wept was said to be truly moved. One who confessed calmly might be labelled as prideful. Tears became currency. Wailing, premium content. Brother Gilbert, a confessor at a wealthy abbey, ranked his penitent's remorse from 1 to 10 and adjusted penances accordingly. When asked if this was appropriate, he shrugged. God sees the heart, but I see the face. The system fed itself. The more rules were written, the more sins were discovered. Entire categories of micro-sin emerged. Thinking impure thoughts during matins, smirking during veneration, not bowing deeply enough to relics. It became a spiritual surveillance state, self-enforced. Monks began pre-confessing thoughts they feared might become sins. One novice confessed that he sometimes imagined the Virgin Mary rolling her eyes during long chants. He was given 2 days of silence and extra candle duty. And yet, for all the absurdity, people played along. Because in a world without guarantees, guilt gave structure. It told you what to fear, what to fix, what to pay. And as monasteries tightened the confessional loop, they gained power. Towns began sending lists of communal sins for group absolution. One village submitted an annual confession scroll describing their harvest envy and preemptive goat theft. In return, the monks offered blessings and a fresh supply of sermon scrolls. The whole thing had the strange flavour of religious bureaucracy fused with medieval marketing. Sins were tallied, piety was promoted, failure was repackaged as renewal. And here's the criticism. Sealed in ink, they forgot why confession existed at all. It wasn't supposed to be a performance. It wasn't supposed to be scored. It was meant to be the moment you took off the mask and dared to speak the worst parts of yourself aloud. But once you turned it into math, once guilt became a commodity, you stopped healing. You just played the game. Brother Thaddeus died with his charts neatly bound and shelved in a cedar box. His monastery displayed them for years. Tourists came. Some confessed. Others laughed. A few, after reading, quietly wept. Not because the numbers moved them, but because, in all those boxes and rules, they saw something terrifyingly familiar. A system that measured everything except grace. By the early 1500s, the confessional algorithm had embedded itself so deeply into monastic life that even monks began to forget what life had been like before. Sin came with a ledger. It wasn't enough to repent anymore. You had to do it correctly. With the right posture, the right phrasing, and preferably some tears, or at least a tremble in your voice. Spirituality had become procedural, a checklist of gestures and guilt, neatly stacked like manuscripts on a dusty shelf. And in this rigid world, monks started to break down. Brother Isidore was one of them. An aging scribe in a monastery known for its penitential accuracy, he had spent 20 years copying sin ledgers by candlelight. He could recite the entire chart of offences from memory. He knew exactly which sin was trending in which region. He had even created a footnote system for distinguishing envy born of famine from envy born of fashion. But one morning, he simply stopped writing. Not out of rebellion, out of emptiness. I have written 1,000 sins, he whispered, but I have forgotten what it feels like to be forgiven. It wasn't just Isidore. Across Europe, a strange malaise settled in. Monks confessed more, but smiled less. Novices entered cloisters with eager hearts and left with furrowed brows. Sermons became mechanical. The same sins, the same penances, the same flat cadence repeated to a weary audience. And behind it all was the creeping suspicion that no one actually felt better. They just felt scored. The numbers kept moving, but the people did not. Abbeys began producing quarterly reports on spiritual activity. Charts were drawn, confession spikes before Easter, slumps in summer. One abbey posted its highest guilt per capita ratio and celebrated with an extra feast day. But no one ate much, because it turned out living under a constant microscope of morality didn't inspire holiness. It inspired performance anxiety. Some monks responded by doubling down. They developed contemplative audit routines, wherein they reviewed their thoughts hourly, ranking each according to virtue proximity. Others created guilt journals, daily entries graded by senior monks for depth of remorse. Brother Lucien, a particularly devout monk in southern France, recorded 2,306 sins in a single year. His entries were praised for their detail. He died at 34. A few monasteries tried to lighten the load. They introduced communal confessions, group repentance ceremonies, and rotating absolution queues. But it didn't help. The structure was too ingrained. Even joy became suspect. A laughing monk might be reprimanded for lightness of spirit during penitential season. One was fined a full week's worth of candle time for smiling during Lent. The lay public too began to show cracks. Pilgrims arrived with lists of sins prepared in advance. Children memorized penance schedules like multiplication tables. Some towns hosted sin lotteries, pull a parchment, reveal your vice, pay in advance. It was morbidly efficient. But beneath the rituals, a quiet detachment grew. People confessed, but with hollow eyes. They wept, but mostly from habit. They feared hell, yes, but heaven? That felt like a bureaucratic reward, a bonus unlocked through proper documentation. It was around this time that satire crept in. Anonymous tracts began appearing, mocking the entire system. One featured a fictional monk who repented for sneezing without crossing himself. Another described a woman who confessed to confessing too often, thereby committing the sin of spiritual vanity. These writings were funny and terrifying because they were true. The church tried to respond. Papal bulls were issued, clarifications drafted, but nothing could stop the sense that something had been lost. The soul of confession, the messy, terrifying intimacy of laying bare your darkness before another human being, had been replaced by a form, a rubric, a clerical game. And here's the thread of criticism, glowing beneath the ash. In chasing purity, the church had constructed a labyrinth, not to trap sinners, but to measure them. Every turn was a checkbox, every chamber a calculation. And while it looked impressive from the outside, inside it was cold, echoing, and deeply lonely. Brother Isidore's final act was not dramatic. He didn't burn the ledgers or denounce the system. He simply walked into the chapel one morning, placed his ink-stained hands on the altar, and sat. He stayed there for 3 days. No prayers, no confessions, just silence. When he finally spoke, he said only this: God is not a grid. They buried him behind the scriptorium, near the wall that once held the monastery's first confessional. His grave was unmarked, but for years afterward monks would stop there and leave behind small offerings, a broken quill, a blank scroll, a candle half melted, not because he was famous, but because he reminded them, however briefly, that grace isn't something you count. It's something you feel, and if it can't be felt, no amount of tallying will bring it back. Chapter 8, Monkfluences and the Scroll Economy. By the early 16th century, monasteries were facing a brutal truth: the model wasn't scaling anymore. Scroll sales were down. Monkfluencer influence had plateaued. Guilt, once a dependable renewable resource, was beginning to feel exhausting. The faithful were saturated, and even the most devout pilgrims were starting to ask uncomfortable questions like, do I really need 6 indulgences for the same sin? And why is St. Hildegard now available in platinum and gold tier blessings? The answer, of course, was simple: recurring revenue. Welcome to faith as a service. It began, as these things do, with good intentions. A modest abbey in Bruges started offering weekly prayer bundles for travelling merchants. For a small donation, monks would pray on the donor's behalf while they were away. The concept caught on quickly. Why risk sinning abroad when someone back home could be preemptively chanting for your moral stability? Before long, these prayer bundles evolved. Monthly plans emerged. Feast day boosts were introduced. The truly ambitious monasteries offered what they called eternal subscriptions, a one-time high-value donation in exchange for perpetual prayer. Your soul, they promised, would be remembered at every Mass. They even had contracts. The language was exquisite. Whereas the donor, being of sound faith and temporal resources, doth submit his soul into the blessed routines of this holy house, it was holiness by retainer. Spirituality with a support plan. At first, it seemed like a clever fix. Monks now had predictable income. Donors had peace of mind. And the church? It looked efficient, forward-thinking. But underneath, the rot had only deepened. Because what they were selling wasn't prayer. It was presence. And presence by nature cannot be outsourced. Still, the model spread. Abbeys began diversifying their offerings. One offered the Miracle Monitor plan, a yearly audit of the donor's spiritual condition, complete with custom blessing scrolls and a free relic sniffing limited to regional saints. Another developed a sacrament as a service package, confession by proxy, with trained monks handling your repentance while you remained sinfully stationary. They even created tiered access to relics. Bronze tier got you seasonal proximity. Silver tier included tactile blessing rites. Gold tier granted a guaranteed relic touch at Easter, plus a handwritten note from a monk thanking you for your patronage and promising to pronounce your name with extra devotion. One monastery went full innovation and offered time-shared pilgrimage, pay once, and your name would be carried on a wooden plaque by a designated pilgrim to various holy sites. Technically, your soul travelled. Spiritually, it counted. But here's where it gets darker. Some of the faithful stop showing up entirely. Why attend Mass when your premium subscription included automatic intercession? Why confess when your sins were already prepaid? Devotion became passive, a background process, like setting your soul to autopilot. Monks noticed. They began referring to certain donors as shadow souls. Their names were on the rolls, their payments received, but their presence was never felt. One scribe wrote, "They are like ghosts who pay their own toll, but never pass through the gate." Even the monks themselves grew hollow. Prayer shifted from supplication to obligation. It was no longer a divine act, but a deliverable. One group of monks started logging prayers in ledgers, checking them off like invoices. Another created standard prayer templates to streamline the process. Insert name here, insert ailment, insert plea. A few monasteries even explored mechanized chanting. A choir wheel was designed to spin parchment inscribed with invocations, generating continuous prayer with 0 monk hours. And still, people paid. Not because they believed it worked, but because not paying felt risky. What if their neighbour's soul got the last candle blessing? What if a rival merchant secured an indulgence edge? Faith became insurance, a divine subscription model built not on inspiration, but on fear of spiritual FOMO. Of course, the Church sanctioned it all. Officially, these were tools to strengthen the faithful. Unofficially, they were a gold mine. Some dioceses developed faith portfolios, tracking which donors had purchased which sacraments, and adjusting future offerings accordingly. There was even an attempt to gamify it, a relic loyalty program where each donation earned tokens redeemable for saint medallions or guaranteed choir mentions. Brother Matthias, an elderly monk who had spent 4 decades in a mountain monastery, wept when he first saw the plan. "We used to speak to God," he whispered, "not invoice him." But criticism was easily brushed aside. The system was efficient, the coffers were full, and the metrics looked holy enough. Here's the thread of critique wrapped in parchment and gold leaf. The monasteries mistook automation for absolution. They believed that outsourcing piety could preserve its power. But they forgot that faith, unlike parchment or relics, does not scale. You cannot replicate devotion. You can only practice it. And in turning prayer into a product, they lost something crucial. Not the donors, not the relics, but the silence between the words, the moment before the chant begins, the tremble in the voice of someone who knows they are truly speaking to the unknown, that cannot be scheduled, and no subscription plan will bring it back. For the peasants, faith as a service might have seemed invisible at first. They still saw the abbey on the hill, still heard the bells, still knelt at roadside shrines. But slowly, subtly, the ground beneath them shifted. Blessings no longer came by way of spontaneous kindness or shared candles. They arrived by parchment, by seal, by fee. And what had once been an act of communal grace began to feel more like paperwork. A farmer in Burgundy learned that to bless his new plough, he would need a signed blessing form from the monastery. Not an impossible ask, but the monk assigned to his parish now lived 2 towns over, and travel cost coin. Another woman, widowed and worried for her son's soul, tried to commission a mass, only to be informed that gold-tier subscribers were prioritized for the coming feast cycle. She wept, of course, not because she lacked faith, but because the structure had locked her out. Meanwhile, relic circulation had gone fully commercial. Travelling monks, called grace couriers, transported vials of holy water, strips of sacred cloth, and even slivers of saint bone between patrons. One Benedictine house offered express relic leases, a 3-day proximity package with optional incense. It came with a tiny scroll of usage instructions and a wax-sealed guarantee of moderate spiritual uplift. At first people believed, then they hesitated, then they laughed. Religious piracy emerged as the inevitable side effect. Unaffiliated monks, often former novices or clerics turned rogue, set up their own prayer stalls. They offered knock-off blessings, fake relics, even handwritten indulgent scrolls with invented sigils. The church called them heretics. The villagers called them affordable. One of the most infamous was a man named Father Gerwin. Once a copyist at a respected monastery, he abandoned the cloth to become a freelance preacher. His sermons were loud, theatrical, and laced with a wicked charm. He'd set up shop near pilgrimage routes, undercut monastery prices, and offer buy one absolution, get one afterlife guarantee. He was wildly popular. The church excommunicated him twice. He sold commemorative scrolls about it, and while Father Gerwin may have been a sideshow, the sentiment he tapped into was very real. People were tired of renting their faith, tired of subscription models for salvation, tired of watching monks pray for donors they'd never meet while the sick lay untreated outside abbey walls. And yet, the monasteries didn't stop. They doubled down. Faith metrics became more elaborate. Some abbeys instituted prayer response time policies. A donor would receive a handwritten note within 5 days of their request, confirming receipt and projected prayer delivery. Larger abbeys developed internal routing systems, assigning different sins or blessings to specific monks based on experience. Brother Armand handled infertility. Sister Jacoba specialized in livestock illness. Each was given a quota. It was efficient. It was soul-numbing. Monks began to crack. The older generation, those who remembered when prayer was private and sacred, withdrew from the main routines. They formed unofficial contemplative cells, praying silently for hours in dim corridors. No scrolls, no quotas, just breath and candlelight. But the younger monks, trained in output and performance, burned fast. Brother Aldrich fainted during a prayer session after trying to fulfill 37 blessing requests in one morning. Sister Helena suffered a nervous collapse when a donor requested a custom prayer involving 3 saints, 2 psalms, and a 24-hour vigil. She lasted 16 hours before falling asleep and waking to a scolding and a revoked donation. And here's where the light sarcasm meets the dark truth. The monasteries had turned sanctity into customer service. And the monks? They were the call centre. The villagers saw it too. Rumours spread. They whispered of abbeys that faked vigils, monks who recycled prayer scrolls, chants performed in empty chapels with no intention behind them. One man claimed he saw a monk snoring during intercession. Another said he found a stack of identical blessings, name slots blank. Faith, it seemed, was becoming too polished to trust. Even the festivals felt hollow. Once a time for joy and shared ritual, they became platforms for upselling. Monasteries set up booths to offer enhanced blessings. Local children were paid to hand out leaflets about the newest subscription tier. The faithful stood in line, not for sacraments, but for redemption receipts. And slowly, the community around these monasteries began to change. More turned inward. Family prayers returned. Lay gatherings grew. People began relying less on monastic blessings and more on each other. It wasn't organised, it wasn't even deliberate, it just happened. A soft rebellion, quiet, persistent. And yet, the abbots didn't see it coming. They were too busy compiling scroll engagement reports and planning miracle launches for next quarter. Here's the criticism written plainly in candle smoke. When faith becomes a product, the faithful become consumers. And consumers are fickle. They remember when the bread was shared, not sold. When the blessing was a look, not a ledger. When the sacred felt sacred, not scheduled. And so a storm began to gather. Not with banners or riots, but with indifference. People stopped writing scrolls, stopped visiting relics, stopped paying. And that, for a subscription-based religion, was the most dangerous miracle of all. Chapter 9. Long before the abbeys fell to fire or faded into quiet ruin, they began to dim from the inside. You couldn't always see it from the outside. The bells still rang, the rituals still flowed, the relics still shimmered under candlelight. But inside the cloisters, behind thick doors and thicker silences, the monks were unravelling. It didn't happen all at once. That's the trick of spiritual decay. It mimics devotion. It looks like longer hours, quieter voices, deeper bows. But when you look closer, you see the difference. The bowed heads don't move. The chants drag. The ink in the scriptorium darkens, not from fresh pigment, but from trembling hands. Monks for centuries had believed their life was one of chosen isolation, sacred labour, and heavenly reward. But now, their days were crowded with metrics, quotas, tiers of faith, and scrolls that measured prayer in volume instead of silence. The monastery wasn't a haven anymore, it was a warehouse. Brother Hadrian was the first to stop speaking. Not out of discipline, but despair. He was known for leading hymns with a voice like carved wood, deep, resonant, sure. But one morning he simply mouthed the words and let the others carry on. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't speak. Perhaps they envied him. Sister Imelda began sleeping through vigils. She was old, yes, and small, barely 5 feet and fading. But she had kept every schedule for 40 years. Now she would wake only for lauds, sit quietly through the chants, and then vanish into the herb garden. She tended no plants, she just sat in the dirt and watched the sky. And no one could blame her. Because when your vocation becomes an industry, your soul gets crowded out. It's not that the monks didn't believe anymore. It's that they didn't know what belief looked like in a system that rewarded efficiency over sincerity. When you've spent decades performing sanctity to meet expectations, both heavenly and economic, it becomes harder to recognize genuine awe when it arrives. Even the most devout began to break. Brother Caspar, a chronic rule follower with a knotted spine and perfect penmanship, was found one morning redacting entire psalms from the Book of Hours. When asked why, he simply said, "These ones don't work anymore." His punishment was soft extra silence, limited ink. But the damage echoed. Casper's edit spread through the cloister like mould. Monks began hesitating at familiar verses. Was this one true? Did that one still mean anything? One couldn't help but wonder how much of their faith was ritual inertia. And here's the uncomfortable truth. No one teaches monks what to do when the sacred stops feeling sacred. Their training prepares them for sin, for temptation, for doubt. But not for boredom. Not for burnout. Not for the slow erosion of meaning beneath perfect obedience. So they adapted the only way they knew how, by going through the motions. Psalms were chanted on autopilot. Manuscripts were copied without comprehension. Confessions were received like business memos, nodded through and filed away. Prayer became posture. Worship became task. Faith became hollow. And still, the structure held. That's the brilliance and cruelty of the monastic machine. It was designed to survive even when the people inside it had nothing left to give. You could run a monastery on the momentum of dead saints and burnt candles alone. As long as the form remained, no one questioned the function. But the rot was spreading. Novices left, fewer joined. Recruitment scrolls were sent to nearby towns, but most went unanswered. Those who did arrive were younger, more cynical, less reverent. Some came for the food, others to hide. One arrived with a lute and a laugh, claiming he was here to wait out the world's end. They weren't wrong. The world outside was changing. The plague had thinned villages, war had redrawn borders, and the printing press was beginning to whisper of new knowledge, unfiltered by robes or relics. Inside, the monks prayed on. And here lies the criticism carved beneath the gold leaf. Institutions that forget why they were built will always mistake repetition for purpose. The monks believed that by preserving the form, they were preserving the faith. But what they were really doing was embalming it. Not killing it outright, just keeping it stiff and polished, a kind of spiritual taxidermy. Beautiful, hollow, and entirely unbothered by living souls. Some monasteries tried to adapt. They introduced meditation gardens, loosened chant schedules, and offered personal prayer time without quotas. A few rediscovered silence, not as punishment, but as presence. And for a moment, something flickered, something real. But it didn't last, because the system was still in place. And the system didn't know how to run on flickers. So the monks continued, bowed over altars, scribbling in margins, lighting candles no one watched. Not out of belief. Not anymore. But because they didn't know how to stop. As the monks withered beneath the weight of unspoken doubt, the effects didn't stay locked behind cloister gates. Institutions, like bodies, eventually leak their sickness. What began as private exhaustion soon bled into public doctrine. Because, when the ones charged with embodying faith begin to falter, the scaffolding creaks. And when enough scaffolding groans, people start looking up. At first, it was subtle. The homilies grew thinner. The theology more recycled. Priors reused entire feast day sermons, tweaking only the saint's name and local blessing metrics. A sharp villager might catch it. Didn't he say that about St. Erasmus last week? But most didn't, or pretended not to, because questioning sermons still carried risk. But then the language changed. Gone was the fire. Gone was the awe. The words of God began to sound like meeting minutes. Monastic Latin, once thunderous and lush, doled to the rhythm of a tired bell. The message was still there, but the soul behind it was vanishing. Outside the abbeys, whispers began to gather. Lay preachers, once ignored as eccentric or heretical, found audiences swelling. They spoke with passion, not always accuracy. But passion was enough, because it had been so long since anyone had heard it from a pulpit. One wandering friar, Brother Luca, gaunt as a lantern post and twice as bright, stood barefoot in muddy markets quoting verses in the common tongue. He wept when he preached, laughed too. People followed him, not because he was right, but because he was real. The church, of course, hated him, but it couldn't stop him, because men like Luca were symptoms, not causes. They were what bubbled up when the official voices fell silent. They were proof that people still needed God, but no longer trusted those who sold him. And the monasteries? They responded the only way they knew how, by doubling down. Abbeys released doctrinal clarifications, scrolls reminding the faithful that proper salvation still required monastic intercession, that lay gatherings, though well-meaning, lacked sacramental authority, that passion without orthodoxy was dangerous, emotional, feminine. It didn't land, because by then something had cracked, a psychological levee that centuries of incense and architecture had held in place, and once it broke, nothing could unbreak it. Inside the monasteries, the crisis of faith turned into a crisis of identity. What was a monk if not a guardian of God's mystery? And what was mystery when villagers were quoting psalms in taverns without permission? Brother Theodoric, a once promising theologian, locked himself in the library for a month, attempting to write a definitive scroll on divine hierarchy. He emerged with a 94-page treatise, half of it crossed out, the rest composed in a mixture of Latin, Greek, and what one reader described as panicked poetry. It was never copied. Others chose silence, not the meditative kind, the stunned, embarrassed kind. Young monks, once eager to teach, now sat quietly during parish visits, unable to answer questions that once felt simple. Why do monks need donations to pray? Why can't we read scripture ourselves? Why does faith feel like a purchase? There were no good answers. So the church issued distractions, new relics, jubilee indulgences. Rare saint festivals reintroduced with pageantry and banners. Some monasteries leaned into miracle revivalism, reporting signs and wonders with suspicious punctuality. A weeping Madonna on the third Thursday of every month. A speaking corpse who only recited doctrine. It was spiritual theatre. But it didn't fool everyone. A baker in Prague was said to laugh during a relic procession. Just a small scoff. The monks excommunicated him. His bakery tripled in business. A weaver in Bruges stitched verses onto her cloth, selling them to local women. She had never been inside a monastery. When asked where she learned the words, she said, "My grandmother," by firelight. And here comes the thread of criticism, sharp as a quill. Monasteries believed they owned the sacred, that without their sanction, faith was counterfeit. But what they failed to understand, what centuries of routine had erased, was that faith does not need to be licensed to be real. The monks weren't evil. They were exhausted. They had built a fortress around God to protect him from dilution, only to find themselves prisoners of their own moat. Every attempt to control the divine became a barrier to experiencing it. And so the slow exodus began. Not of monks, but of meaning. The words were still said. The gestures still performed. But the eyes dimmed. The backs slouched. The prayers floated upward and hung in the rafters, unanswered. Not because God was absent, but because no one inside the abbey was truly listening anymore. Outside, villagers knelt in fields. They prayed over childbirths and harvests. They sang their own hymns, made their own sacraments. It wasn't orthodox, it wasn't even coordinated. But it was alive. And in the end, it was life, not legacy, that would carry faith forward. Chapter 10, Legacy Code and Eternal Hosting. Centuries after the last ink dried in the scriptorium, after the final chant faded into the rafters and the relic cabinets were repurposed into tourist exhibits, something remarkable happened. The monasteries kept going. Not as spiritual engines, not as centres of living faith, but as code bases, as legacy systems, as bureaucratic ghosts. It began with the records. Monks, for all their burnout and existential collapse, were meticulous archivists. Every donation, every prayer, every land grant and hairline miracle was logged in crisp, narrow script. The margins were filled with doodles, yes, but the structure was clean. Indexes, inventories. cross-referenced miracles with feast day footnotes. These weren't just scrolls, they were servers. So when kingdoms collapsed and borders shifted, people still came to the monasteries, not for blessing, but for documentation. Births, debts, contracts, who owned what, and since when. The abbeys, it turned out, had been writing the code of civilization all along. And even after their theological software failed, their data remained valuable. Brother Thomas, a 15th century monk with no remaining faith but an obsessive love for order, once described his job as debugging the will of God. He maintained a ledger so accurate it survived 3 regime changes and is still referenced in German property disputes today. He believed in structure, not sanctity. And that was enough. By the early modern period, many former monasteries had become archives, libraries, or regional bureaucratic centres. Their churches crumbled. Their relics were boxed up or quietly vanished. But their filing systems, untouched. Some abbeys began charging access fees. You could walk in and retrieve your grandfather's baptismal record for a modest sum, cheaper if you brought your own candle. The monks who remained weren't monks anymore. They were custodians. IT support for a spiritual mainframe no one dared unplug. They kept the lights on, metaphorically and sometimes literally, stoking fires in drafty halls where no one prayed. They didn't teach doctrine. They taught indexing. And here comes the satire. Centuries after preaching the impermanence of worldly things, the monasteries became the most permanent institutions in Europe. It was eternal hosting. Some governments tried to nationalize them. Others privatized them. One ambitious noble family rebranded a former abbey as a heritage processing hub and offered guided tours that included simulated chanting and a complimentary scroll-themed bookmark. The gift shop made more in a month than the monastery had raised in its final year of real devotion. And still, the records sat there, patient, undisturbed, thousands of them, on parchment, on vellum. Some monks had even anticipated damage from fire and water, making duplicate copies, burying them in clay tubes, sealing them behind false altars. It was disaster recovery, medieval style. They called it faith. We call it redundancy. Meanwhile, universities mined these archives like data miners in a digital vault. They digitized them, annotated them, published papers with titles like Sacramental Workflows in 13th Century Rhineland and Latency and Replication across Benedictine scriptoriums. What once was worship became metadata, and the monks, forgotten mostly, except as tags. But this wasn't death. It was mutation. Faith had left the building, yes, but the building still worked. Pilgrims became tourists. Liturgies became reenactments. Gregorian chants became Spotify playlists. One tech startup tried to train a language model on monastic manuscripts to generate auto-prayers. It crashed after producing 600 variations of "O Lord, deliver me from this task." And yet, we kept going back. Because there's something about these cold, candle-burned spaces that still hums. Not with belief necessarily, but with memory. With weight. With the echo of lives spent writing meaning into silence. Maybe it doesn't matter that the monks are gone. Maybe it matters more that they were ever there at all. And here's the final critique, whispered like a closing benediction. The monasteries promised eternity. What they delivered was infrastructure. And in a strange, sideways way, they succeeded. Because even stripped of miracles and mysticism, they endured. Not as temples, but terminals. Faith faded. Files remained. And now, centuries later, we log in, not with prayers, but passwords. We search not for absolution, but records. Yet in that search, in the quiet reverence with which we open those yellowing pages, maybe something holy still flickers. Legacy code, eternal hosting, divine uptime. Even God, it seems, respects clean documentation. In the end, The strangest legacy of the monastic startup age isn't what they built. It's what they accidentally preserved. Not doctrine, not miracles, but something quieter, slipperier, and almost impossible to quantify. Process. The monks may have aimed for salvation, but what they left behind was structure. Habits codified into time. Faith distilled into repetition. A metaphysical operating system built from silence and scraped skin. Centuries later, those same patterns still echo through the corridors of institutions that barely remember their origins. The modern university schedule? Born from monastic prayer rhythms, bureaucratic redundancies, departmental hierarchies, archival standards, all lifted from the silent grind of cloisters. Even our obsession with schedules, calendars, and time blocks owes a debt to monks who carved eternity into manageable units. We rarely credit them. Why would we? It's easier to see the monks as relics themselves, robed oddities mumbling in Latin, forever stuck in medieval sepia. But beneath the robes were project managers, system thinkers, early knowledge workers, hunched over desks for 12-hour shifts, organising information with only candlelight and chronic guilt to keep them focused. But here's where it gets darker. They didn't mean to give us this inheritance. The processes they refined weren't tools. They were spiritual disciplines, meant to shape the soul, not manage inventory. But when the soul stepped out of the room, the skeleton stayed. And we took that skeleton and dressed it in glass and metal and fibre optics. We called it productivity. We called it civilization. And now we run on it. Every time we sort by date, every time we archive, schedule, or log in, every workflow software and time tracking app has monastic blood in its code. We're not building something new, we're just iterating the rule of St. Benedict with shinier buttons. And like the monks before us, we've confused the system with the substance. Modern institutions worship at the altar of process. We measure success not by depth but by throughput. Hours worked, emails sent, tasks closed. It's eerily familiar. 1,000 years ago, Brother Anselm was evaluated on how many pages he illuminated. Today, it's how many tabs we close. But there's a cost. The monks at least knew they were sacrificing for something. They may have burned out under ritual, but they believed the ritual meant something. We, by contrast, are often left with the machinery but no meaning. Endless cycles of optimized labor with no liturgical goal at the end. Just more work, more noise, more update patches. This is the legacy and the warning. When the monasteries collapsed, no one expected their ghosts to become our operating systems. But they did, because code is nothing if not scripture without saints. And our secular age has saints of its own now. Productivity gurus, software prophets, startup monks with TED Talks in place of psalms. They preach about purpose, about clarity, about living with intention. And then they offer a download link, a calendar template, a Notion dashboard. The modern monk doesn't chant, he sinks. He doesn't pray, he aligns goals. And the soul? Well, it's penciled in between 4,000, 4,000, 4,005. If the meeting doesn't run over. But the monasteries, those stone servers humming with long dead hands, they remind us of something we rarely admit. That process without pause becomes noise. That rituals repeated without reflection collapse into performance. And that even sacred systems rot from the inside if no one remembers why they exist. In a strange way, the monks had it right, even in their decay. They showed us what happens when belief is subordinated to function, when reverence is measured in metrics, when eternity is scheduled by the hour. So perhaps, at the very end, the lesson isn't to abandon the system, but to re-inhabit it, to take the schedule and breathe into it, to chant again, not because it scales, but because it centers, to copy texts not for output, but understanding, to let silence mean something, The monks weren't perfect. They clung to power. They sold blessings. They faked miracles and buried questions. But they also stared into candle flames and asked the terrifying, beautiful question that every age forgets to ask: what is this for? And maybe that's where we begin again. Not with metrics, not with relics, but with that one stubborn, sacred, disruptive question. Because in the end, what outlasted the chants, the scrolls, the startups, and even the saints was the pause between words, the space before the prayer, the holy breath before the system restarts. So here we are, dear listener, 10 chapters, 20 segments, and several dozen monks later. We've walked the stone corridors, we've squinted at ink-stained scrolls, we've watched relics get monetized, prayer get productized, and faith quietly outsourced to the spiritual equivalent of a help desk. And maybe, just maybe, you recognize something familiar in those monasteries. The quotas, the burnout, the meetings disguised as miracles, the beautiful systems that somehow forgot what they were built for. Because what this wasn't, and never tried to be, was a nostalgia trip. It was a mirror, a quiet, candlelit warning from the past that even the holiest structures collapse when the soul goes missing. But also a strange kind of hope. Because even after the monks gave up, even after the relics were boxed and the chants digitized, something still pulsed through those old walls. A whisper, a breath, a space. A reminder that meaning doesn't have to scale, that silence is not inefficiency, and that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is nothing, just for a moment, and ask, what is this for? So whether you're building your own monastery, your own startup, or just trying to survive the inbox that never dies, remember the monks. Not the polished, gold-leafed ones, the tired ones, the doubting ones, the ones who stayed anyway. Because in a world of non-stop scrolls, both digital and divine, the real miracle might just be knowing when to stop. Thanks for walking with us. This has been The Drowsy Historian. Sleep well, or don't. History won't judge you, but it will remember.